This is Dan Schneider. This is another American TV with Mitchell Hadley. This time around, we're going to be talking about the evolution of the American variety show, and the conversation will begin in a moment. So, Mitch, we're back, and this time we're going to be doing variety shows. Now, this is one of those areas where there probably will be people watching this will say, well, was that really a variety show? Or maybe this was a variety show. Is a variety show just a talent contest? Is it something like Laugh-In, which was the number one show for 2 or 3 years in the 60s and 70s? But we'll get to definitions and stuff in a moment. First off, welcome, Mitch, and let's start back from, I guess, even before TV, those kinds of shows that were variety shows in the radio days, as Woody Allen has it in one of his movies. Who were the big players in radio that first transitioned over to television in the late 40s?
Well, I think it's nice to be back, by the way, Dan. Good to see you again. And I just want to assure all of our viewers that I am not a candidate for the Speaker of the House of Representatives, so I'm just staying put right where I am. But the variety show, as it migrates over to the era of television, you see stars like Jimmy Durante, Bob Hope, Bing Crosby. They don't all make the transition to television right away. And when they do make the transition, they don't all transition into doing weekly shows. Some of them just do specials, but all of them, Arthur Godfrey, even Milton Berle, becomes a huge TV star, but he did start out on radio, and he had a modicum of success. TV really wound up being his medium. But variety shows began in the days of vaudeville, of course, and they were one of the first types of show to make the transition over to radio. And hence, when television starts to become a thing, variety shows are among the first types of programming to be seen on television. And it goes all the way back to the pre-World War II days when television was in an experimental mode. Variety shows were among the shows that began to be on an experimental basis. So it was natural that after you had television come more fully into bloom in the post-World War II era, and you started having programming on a regular basis, that you would see variety shows become the first really big successes on television. And the first big stars that television created were from variety shows. That's where I bring in someone like Berle. He was an average radio personality, but on television he became this outrageous comedian doing all kinds of over-the-top skits, really vaudeville in a pure sense. And that was something the TV audience ate up. So for a very short period of time, maybe 2 or 3 years, during the process of TV evolving, Berle was the biggest thing on TV, Mr. Television. And I think that his Texaco Star Theater is really the first show that we would identify as being a pure television variety show. Roots were back in the past, but this is the first one to really make it big as a TV series.
So, Mitch, you mentioned Milton Berle. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other people there. Arthur Godfrey, most explicitly, was the first, I guess, maybe not the first, but the biggest talent show guy. And talent shows, it could be argued that, talent shows might deserve their own sort of medium. But what was the major difference between Godfrey and the Berle format?
Well, when you're talking about Godfrey had a regular cast of characters, if you will. They were called the Little Godfreys. And at various times you had most famously Julius LaRosa, but you had Pat Boone, you had the McGuire sisters, you had people who were with him and appeared with him week after week. But in addition, you also had people who were new to to the medium, people who were just coming along that Godfrey was introducing. And in Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts, you had the concept that Godfrey and the people who worked with him were out there scouting around for new talent and people that they would showcase on television and would become the next big thing. And I think Pat Boone, for example, is an I think is a good example of somebody who becomes in a way discovered by Godfrey, then goes on to become a Godfrey regular, then goes on to host a variety show of his own. As a matter of fact, he becomes the youngest entertainer ever to host a television variety show. He was still in his early to mid 20s when he got his own show. So he was a great example of somebody who actually became a star through Godfrey. Burl, on the other hand, depends more on set pieces. The traditional concept of a variety show. You have Burl acting in skits. You have Burl in set pieces. You have Burl introducing guest stars who are already acknowledged stars, recognizable faces. And it all centers around Burl. So without Milton Berle, you don't have Texaco Star Theater. He's the driver of the show, and everything is focused on him. I would say that that's one of the major differences in variety shows when you look at different incarnations of them, are the shows like Burl's where he's the star. And I would include people like Perry Como and Bob Hope and Andy Williams in that category, that they're involved in the show in an active way. Then you have other shows like Ed Sullivan's, where Sullivan is really just a presenter. He very rarely takes part in the act itself unless he's having them come over to chat for a minute after their appearance. But mostly Sullivan is just acting as an MC rather than a participant in the show. And there are other shows that go on in that vein as well. The Hollywood Palace, which comes along in the 60s, is in a way a similar show. It has a rotating host, different host every week. Bing Crosby is the most familiar host, but there's a different host every week. Sometimes that host is more of a singer, entertainer, comedian, where they're going to be involved actively in the show. But other times it's going to be somebody like, Elizabeth Montgomery, where she isn't going to be in all of it. She's going to be doing more of the introducing and the MC type of function. So the Palace is kind of a hybrid, but that's another example, I think, of a show where the emphasis is on the guest as much as or even more than the host.
Now, Godfrey was presumably a talent show, but it wasn't a contest, was it? And Sullivan already had established names, so right. Godfrey was dipping more into the amateur pool, but it wasn't like the latest spoof that was done of it, The Gong Show.
Right. Now, I would say that if you're thinking of a pure talent contest type of show, then you're going back to Major Beau's original Amateur Hour, which was a radio stalwart, going back almost as far as radio went. And Major Beau's was introducing various acts, and that's what his function was. And people would vote. They would send in their telegrams, their letters, later on phone calls, but you would have the audience voting for the winners. Frank Sinatra, I think, was an early winner on Amateur Hour. Now, when that makes the transition to television, it's going to be more familiar to viewers because Beau's died off. Literally. And so what you had was a man named Ted Mack, who became the host of the original Amateur Hour. And that was an institution on Sunday afternoons, early Sunday evenings for many, many years. The Amateur Hour was eventually bumped off of the air, as so many shows were on Sundays, because of the rise in televised sports. But up until even 1970, you could count on seeing Ted Mack. And that was again a situation where people would call in and vote that way. And so when you think of the genesis of the talent shows that we see on TV today, they really owe their roots to him more, I think, than to somebody like Godfrey. Although Godfrey may have had a higher percentage of people who would go on to some kind of stardom, because Godfrey had the other shows, radio and TV, that enabled him to make somebody a star. The other shows were pure talent shows in the sense that the audience took part in them.
So by about 1950-51, I remember when we did the 50 show, we see the emergence of people like Jackie Gleason and Sid Caesar. Gleason has a show on the air in some form or another for the next 15, 20 years. Sid Caesar, though, is an interesting case because he's well remembered in television history as being one of the innovators. I think a lot of the people in the original Saturday Night Live pointed to the Sid Caesar show, the show of shows, as being an inspiration for them. But he seems to not have held up for some reason the way... He's closer to Milton Berle in being seen as old-fashioned rather than Jackie Gleason as being seen as timeless. Why do you think that is? And what other people like the Gleasons and the Caesars came along in the early 50s?
Well, I think as far as Caesar goes, there are a couple of things that you might look at. I'm not going to try to psychoanalyze viewers as far as what appeals to them or not. So I'm just kind of taking a crack at it from my own thoughts. But when I watch Sid Caesar today, what I'm struck by, first of all, is the length of the skits that he's in. They'll go 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes, and they're very involved, and they are long skits. And I think that part of the problem you have is just the dwindling attention span that viewers have. They don't have the ability to sit and watch an 8-minute skit anymore. The other thing that strikes me about Caesar is that his humor can be very broad, but at the same time, there is something of a sophistication to them. He would do takeoffs on opera. He would do takeoffs on current events. One of his most famous was a spoof on the Ralph Edwards show, This Is Your Life, where I think most people will remember it. It's probably one of the most famous bits ever from your show of shows, where he's doing the life of somebody who doesn't want to go on stage, and he's dragged on stage to do it. And then as other people are introduced for the reunions, do you remember this person from your past? And it's very, very funny. It combines a certain sophistication with slapstick, with over-the-top humor. And again, it's very long, but it's very funny. But it depends on you being familiar with the concept of This Is Your Life. And when they released a movie in the 70s, I believe. It was called 10 from Your Show of Shows, released into the movie theaters, and it generated a resurgence of interest in Caesar at that point in time. But even then, when you would watch these in the theater, it becomes a communal experience. Everybody's laughing at the same things. But even in the 70s, people still have more of a collective reference point. Most of the people who are watching this would still have known some of these stories. They would have known the This Is Your Life gig. They would have been familiar with some of the stories involved in Italian opera that Caesar might be spoofing. So I think that as we get farther and farther away, it becomes less timeless, and it becomes a little more directly to the time. That and the length of them, that's just a guess. His shows were topical, but they weren't necessarily satirical, and satire is something that for better or worse is a mark of today's comic bits. And the other thing is that I think specifically to Caesar, your show of shows, which he did with Imogene Coca, was on for about 5 years maybe, and hugely successful, a 90-minute show. Then they went their separate ways, and neither one of them were able to duplicate individually what the two of them, what actually the entire cast was able to do. You had Carl Reiner, you had Mel Brooks as one of the writers, you had Howard Morris. It was a brilliant cast.
Didn't Woody Allen also write for them for a while?
Yes, I believe he did, and you had great talent. You had a hugely talented writing and acting staff, but it's hard to recapture that kind of magic. So even though Caesar was successful on his own, and he had a variety of different shows that would come afterwards. Nanette Verbrey was one of his colleagues for a while. Then he had a show like Caesar's Hour, As Caesar Sees It, in through the 60s. But he never quite maintained the fame that he had with Coca. And I think that perhaps that has something to do with it as well, that Caesar drops out of the limelight for a while, that it isn't until the movie comes along that people begin to remember him again, and even then they had the common reference point. And I don't know why.
When you say movie, are you talking about It's a Mad World?
No, I'm sorry. You're right. That was big too. But I'm thinking when they did the movie that was the compilation from your show of shows, that helped to bring Caesar back into the consciousness of the public in the 70s. And I think that worked because people still knew what Caesar was talking about. But otherwise, I don't really know why Caesar's material doesn't survive the way some others do, and I find that as well. I will enjoy a Caesar spoof as much as anybody, but I can't really sit down and watch an entire half hour or hour just of one Caesar skit after another, because they're longer, they take more time, and I suppose I'm a victim of short attention span theater as much as anybody is.
Well, we can talk about some of the other guys in the 50s who came along, but let me posit this about Gleason. I think the reason Gleason still holds up is because he was so attuned to character. If you look at that show, everyone knows Ralph Cramden from The Honeymooners, which started out as a skit on one of the various incarnations. Now, Gleason did fail in radio. He never made it big in radio. He failed with the first version of The Life of Riley, which Bendix went on to have success with. But if you look at the characters, like a Ralph Cramden, Reggie Van Gleason, the poor soul, where he doesn't even speak, I don't believe, the poor soul doesn't even speak. And, maybe a dozen other ones that would be more familiar to people older than me. When I watch them, whatever the length they are, you can't take your eyes off of Gleason, because even though he looks the same, except for maybe a little mustache here or there on Reggie Van Gleason, there's something about his face. There's an expressiveness. And I think we talked about this in one of the earlier shows, which is why I think Gleason is better overall as a comedian than Lucille Ball is. He could get pathos.
Yes.
What do you think about that, the characterization and pathos angle?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the Gleason's characters were identifiable, and he didn't make them to be ridiculed. Even somebody like Reggie Van Gleason, where you're talking about the affected rich character, could be very easy to set him up as a source of ridicule. But there's humor in it, but it's never cruel humor. And I think Gleason identifies, you're right, with the pathos, the idea that there is something about these characters that people identify with, that they like. They like Gleason, they like the characters that he's portraying, and these people find themselves in situations that are not all that different from the situations that you or I might find ourselves in everyday life. We may not be rich, but we may find some uncomfortable role where we have an overdue parking meter, or we spill something on our shirt, or anything like that his characters had things happen to them or were involved in things that anybody could appreciate. And I think you're right that Gleason has that ability to be able to reach out. That's why Ralph Kramden, people, it's very fashionable, I think, to think of Ralph Kramden as being a misogynist nowadays. I consider him to be more a product of his time. The way women are treated in The Honeymooners is typical of the way women were treated back then. I don't think that you say that Kramden is a misogynist. To the contrary, I think that people identify with Kramden as a guy who's always trying to find the next thing that's going to help him to get rich, to get ahead, to be a success, and he's invariably failing. His wife is invariably sticking with him no matter what. Alice, you're the greatest. It all ends. Those are things that ordinary people can identify, and it's why the State Department recognized The Honeymooners as the type of a show that they could export to other countries that would show some of the greatness of America and of capitalism and of the ability for people to be able to succeed. So Gleason has that way of being able to tap into these characters. And then when you look at Gleason acting in non-Gleason show type roles, when you see him in a movie like The Hustler, where he gets a Best Supporting Actor nomination for very little time on the screen, you see Gleason's ability to be able to inhabit a character and to make it real to the viewer. So Gleason has that exceptional type of ability. And I think it's something that he's able to tap into and people are able to identify with. And I think that more than perhaps anything else is what makes Gleason timeless, in that sense, that people will always be able to identify with the characters he's portraying or talking about.
Yeah, Requiem for Heavyweights, another one that he was good in.
Yes, tremendous performance.
Who else in the 50s had shows that are not as well known as the Gleasons and the Sid Caesars?
Yeah, well, somebody I forgot to mention at the outset that I should have was Red Skelton, because Skelton was a huge hit on radio, and he was able to make the transformation over to television for well over a decade. And his characters, and again, we're talking about a character-based comedian, and I think you really tapped into something there in talking about Gleason, that Skelton is very similar, that he's got his stable of characters that he plays, from Clem Cadiddlehopper to the Mean Whittle Kid to Gertrude and Heathcliff, the two pigeons, I think they are, and Dead-Eyed Dick, and all these different characters that he portrays, and they make a very good transition from radio to television. So Skelton is one of the greats that I should have mentioned earlier. But you've got a lot of people. My wife and I joke that when you look at some of the shows from the 50s, it seems as if everyone had a variety show at one time or another, that all you really had to do was have a name and you could host your own variety show. You had people like Maury Amsterdam, who everybody loves from the Dick Van Dyke Show, but he had his own variety show. Dinah Shore, of course, had a long-running variety show. Perry Como had a variety show. Frank Sinatra had a couple of different shows, and those didn't go over well at all. Even though Sinatra, one of them was before his big comeback and From Here to Eternity, and one of them was after. And you can argue that in the first case, Sinatra hadn't truly discovered who he was as an entertainer yet. He was still in that transitional phase between being the Bobby Sox star and the swinging Frank from the finger-snapping Rat Pack type days. But neither time did Sinatra really make a successful transition to weekly television. Jimmy Durante, who was a big star on radio and in the movies, he was on television for a while. I don't think that his shows particularly hold up, although Durante remains very funny. But you had... I think just about Eddie Fisher had his own show. George Gobel had a variety show. We've talked about that before, I think. Goebel, his first year, was in the top 10 in the ratings, and by the end of his second year, he was fading out. Some of these stars had a shtick that they were able to base things on, whether in Goebel's case being a couple of catchphrases, or in the case of some others, entertainers who became well known for a while. Julius LaRosa was very well known after Arthur Godfrey fired him on air, but you can only be a former Arthur Godfrey performer for so long, and after a while people are not going to watch you because they feel sorry for you anymore. They want to see you do something as yourself. And LaRosa, fine singer, fine entertainer, but I don't think was ever cut out to be the star of a show. And so that's the kind of thing you see. There's one act I want to mention. Act is really the wrong word for it. Show. Arthur Murray, the dance teacher. Arthur and Catherine Murray were on television for a decade as the host of the Arthur Murray Dance Party. And people will not remember that. We're talking about shows that might be lesser remembered. I don't think a lot of people remember Arthur Murray at all anymore, which is a shame, because at the time he was a household name, not just for his television, but for the Arthur Murray dance studios that were all around. But Arthur and Catherine Murray were on TV for a decade. Their show appeared at various times on all four of the TV networks, including Dumont. They had big name talents. So Buddy Holly was on the Arthur Murray show. So you can't ignore a show like that, even though it may not be well known today, that it was a very well-known show at the time.
Yeah, you mentioned Goebel. I think I mentioned in the last time we talked about him a few shows ago. I knew him basically as a Hollywood Square, I think, for 10, 12 years or whatever he did that. And it's like, who is this? Oh, he's on the Hollywood Squares. I had no idea. I thought maybe he was a stand-up comic or something. Who is the fellow, the name just slips me, back in the late 50s, who started, I think, in Pennsylvania, who had the very innovative show. It was local.
Ernie
Kovacs.
Yes.
Kovacs, yeah.
Kovacs is a really interesting character. We could do a whole show just on Ernie Kovacs, I think. You're right. He's probably one of the most creative and influential comedians ever to appear on TV. I would say that Kovacs really falls in the category of a sketch comedy show, because his guests, such as they were more participants in the show. But Kovacs' first successful show on the network, if you go back to the original Ernie Kovacs show from the early 50s, is a variety show, and it's a morning show. People don't think of variety shows being in the morning or daytime, but they were back then. And his first successful show was a regular variety show. He didn't sit down and interview people, but between all of the different weird gags that he would pull, his wife Edie Adams was a classically trained vocalist, and she would always have a number or two, and he had different singers of the era that were on that would perform. So Kovacs had a variety show, but I think that the Kovacs that we know and love today would probably be thought of more just as a comedy show.
You mentioned Arthur Godfrey firing Julius LaRosa. That would have seemed to have been quite a thing back then. Did that make a big hullabaloo, and why was he fired?
There are various stories as to why Godfrey fired LaRosa. He did it right on TV, although it isn't what you would think of in the sense that Donald Trump would say to somebody, "You're fired." LaRosa was a regular on the show, and he did his number, and Godfrey thanked him, and then told everybody, in essence, and that's Julie's last appearance on the show. We want to wish him luck in the future. But he just kind of eased him out like that, and said, and he gave the impression that La Rosa had gotten too big for his britches. Now, as always, the truth of the matter is behind the behind the scenes things. Godfrey had been bothered by the fact that La Rosa had been having an affair with one of the McGuire sisters who happened to be married at the time, and that he thought that was bad for the wholesome nature of his show. There are others who say that there was a contract dispute of some kind, that La Rosa was not kept following through on something Godfrey wanted him to do, that there was a personality clash, different things like that. But if you look at the TV guides of the day, and if you look at the popular magazines, this was a dominant story when it happened. And Godfrey, who had been the king of television at that point in time, was never able to recover from it, because the popular conception, whether it was accurate or not, and as I say, it tends to be a bit more nuanced than people think. The popular conception was that Godfrey was turning out a loyal member of his show whose popularity maybe was getting too high, or that Godfrey was resentful of the attention that La Rosa got, that he was jealous of the attention. But that did play a big role, and it turned the press against Godfrey as well as the viewers. The press started to really snipe at him, and Godfrey was thin-skinned to begin with. So what the negative press did was allow Godfrey's darker side to come through. It had always been there, but there had never been a particular reason for the viewers at home, or just the people at home, to see it until then. And of course, TV Guide jumped on it. All the other entertainment periodicals jumped on it, and they began portraying him in a negative light because he was allowing them to do so. And the more negative it got, the more he would snipe at them, and the more petty he began to look in turn. So gradually, Godfrey has 3 shows on the air at one time, plus his radio show, which is Monday through Friday. That gets scaled back to where Godfrey only has 1 show on, and then Godfrey only has the radio show on, and then Godfrey tries to make a comeback on television, and of all things, Candid Camera, as the co-host of Candid Camera, a role that he is not at all suited for. And so Godfrey becomes just radio until he leaves there, a nostalgia figure, but he is a sad case of a man who burns away a lot of his goodwill. And in a sense, the rise and fall of Arthur Godfrey is not unlike the rise and fall of Milton Berle. Berle didn't kill himself off like that. I don't mean the similarity in that way, but I mean it that at the end of their respective careers, Milton Berle was hosting a show called Jackpot Bowling in the late 50s, early 60s. He's doing his stand-up act as an opening act in a bowling alley before you have a couple of professional bowlers facing off. And you think to yourself, what is Milton Berle doing on Jackpot Bowling? And you could say the same thing about some of Godfrey's appearances near the end of his career. Godfrey doesn't belong with Alan Funt on the Candid Camera, and Funt has him sacked eventually. And they are just shadows of their prior fame. It's a very sad thing to see, but particularly in Godfrey's case, he was the architect of his own downfall.
And what year was this when he fired La Rosa?
I want to say that it was 54. I think it was 53 or 54, but it was during the first year of TV Guide, ironically, and you begin to see Godfrey's on the cover of TV Guide a lot, but as the controversies start to overtake Godfrey's successes, he becomes a regular on the covers with these articles about, can Godfrey come back? Godfrey, the inside story. Will Godfrey fire more people? That kind of thing. So I would go with 54.
I was just wondering if that might have been related to the lack of trust in the quiz show scandals, as if people might have felt betrayed that someone they grown attached to. LaRose, in this case,
I think that
had been treated unfairly.
the quiz shows were a little later in the 50s,
Yeah.
but that's an interesting question, though. If people were already starting to get a little more cynical by that time, we kind of like to look at the quiz show scandals and say that this is where America grew up. But certainly they had examples in the past of people who were not what we thought they were. And you can look at Godfrey and you could say that a movie like Face in the Crowd with Andy Griffith might be based on Godfrey, at least in part. It could be based on a number of people, but the difference between the public Godfrey and the private Godfrey, if you take anything from watching a movie like that, you get the idea of the two different Godfreys and the problem when the private becomes public.
And that kind of tyrannical holdover show has often been levied at Sullivan too. Most famously both with Elvis and the Beatles, and then a little bit later with Jim Morrison and the Doors. They tried to control what these guys were doing.
Yeah. Even Buddy Holly ran into that problem with Sullivan. So just in terms of what Sullivan wanted him to do. And some of these artists would go ahead and do whatever he asked. Others were more reticent to do it. Holly never appeared on the Sullivan Show again after his little contretemps with Ed. It wasn't over the content particularly. It was just over what Sullivan wanted him to do versus what Holly wanted to do. And you're right, though, that Sullivan had that star-making ability, partly because of his television show and partly because he was still a Broadway columnist. And what allowed Sullivan to know so much about the talent and about the industry, not unlike Walter Winchell, his arch adversary. But whereas Sullivan was able to parlay his success on in the newsprint to television, Winchell, who was a hugely successful radio host, never was. Winchell did have his variety show for a while, never became what Sullivan's was, and that haunted Winchell. That's kind of a sidebar, but you're right about Sullivan.
Well, Sullivan also wasn't just a star maker for the obvious things like a singer or a comedian, but I mean, Topo Gigio, in what world does that become, I guess you would call it a meme now.
Yeah, you're right. Well, Sullivan, I think, deserves a minute of his own to talk about the impact he had on television, because Sullivan's show was a variety show in its purest sense, because not only would he have musical guests on the show, he would have the biggest singing stars of the era, whether we're talking about somebody like Elvis or the rock groups that would come along later on, but he would have the hottest names on Broadway. He would have the hottest recording stars. He also had opera stars, Roberta Peters, the great soprano, coloratura soprano. Roberta Peters was on the Sullivan Show 41 times. And Sullivan would not just have opera stars on to sing. He would actually have scenes staged from operas that were going on at the Met. They'd bring in the backstage. They'd bring in the furniture, the scenery. They'd have the singers dressed in costume, and they would recreate scenes from their signature operas. They wouldn't just come on stage and sing, although sometimes they did that too. But Sullivan would do that. And the same thing with Broadway. He would have Broadway performers come on the show and recreate scenes from their most recent hit. Might be something that's playing on Broadway. This is brilliant for Sullivan because he's beaming this out to the entire country. And Sullivan, who is a creature of Broadway, remember, he's writing about Broadway in his columns, knows that the tourist season being vital for the success of Broadway, that when he showcases something like Oklahoma on his program, that's going to create an awareness of these shows in throughout America, Middle America, the West Coast, people who might not ordinarily know about these things, but if they're going to get to Broadway, they're going to see these shows that Sullivan is featuring. So that's Sullivan just has a pure variety shows. The operas, the Broadway shows, the plays, not just musicals but plays. Then he has ventriloquist acts. You remember Signor Wences with the talking fist, and as you mentioned, Topo Gigio.
And wasn't he one of the first to have the Muppets on?
Yep. Exactly, and the stand-up comedians. Alan King was one of his favorites. Myron Cohen, a lot of these Borscht Belt comedians, vaudeville comedians. He had just about every kind of act on the show at a time when America had a much broader taste in their entertainment than they would come to have. So that's why his show could appeal to everyone in the family, because there was something for everyone. And it's difficult to. Sullivan also had a lot of black entertainers. Louis Armstrong was on the cutting edge comedians, somebody like Shelley Berman. So you had all kinds of acts from all over the world. So Sullivan is, as I say, is just that idea of the variety show in a nutshell. There's nothing you might not see on there.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Armstrong thing, because I was going to say I don't know enough about it as you do in regards to someone like Godfrey and these other talent shows. But it seems to me that Ed Sullivan not only had black acts on, but he wasn't the paternal kind of figure. You know, there wasn't. Oftentimes, if you look at 1950s television, if you saw a Nat King Cole on, the host or whatever would talk with a kind of paternal, well, you did a fine job, son,
yes.
Kind of thing.
Yep.
And if not the paternalist thing, I remember just seeing a few reels of when the Jackson 5 appeared on his show. He's actually talking to Michael Jackson at the time, who's clearly the leader of that band, even though he's the youngest one. And he's talking to him as an intelligent being. He's not looking down at him as if he was a pickaninny. You know, this isn't Gone with the Wind. He had respect for the artist, it seemed. I mean, he might have disagreed with them like Buddy Holly or Jim Morrison, but he had a respect for the artist regardless of their color.
And the Supremes are another example of that.
And he would shake their hands too.
Yes. Yes, and he was incredibly fond of the Supremes, Diana Ross and the Supremes, very fond of them, had them on the show a lot. He thought that they were exceptionally talented. They were his kind of talent, good, wholesome, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, that they appealed to a broad public, and they were good. And so that was important to him in the way he would appeal to America. But you're right that there was none of that type of patronizing attitude or anything like that when he was dealing with people like that. Maybe a little bit with some of the rockers, but not even then. I think that Sullivan was an interesting man in that way, because he didn't pretend to understand all of these acts. What he was interested in was whether or not they would appeal to his audience. And if they would, that was the important thing to him. He had that eye for being able to find people who would have that kind of appeal for the viewers.
So before we leave the 1950s variety behind and head into the 60s, let me just bring up one other show that I think started more as a variety show, but then evolved into, the classic talk show, and that's Steve Allen with The Tonight Show. I think the original Tonight Show would be more classified as a variety show than just a pure talk show, as when Carson took over.
I would
do you
agree
with that? And
yes.
what why didn't that Allen format go over? Why did we get? I mean, from Johnny Carson through the two Jimmys now, there's been very little change in that format. Yet you look back at some of the early Steve Allen shows, and it's night and day.
Yeah, if you look at and very few of Allen's Tonight shows are available. But if you were to watch an Allen primetime show, and when he left the Tonight Show, it was to concentrate full time on the primetime show that NBC had put him into opposite Ed Sullivan, and then later it moved to other nights. But any show that you see called the Steve Allen Show gives you that general idea. Allen had a stable of characters that would be on with him that played various roles. Bill Dana was one of them. Louis Nye was another one. I know I'm just thinking off of the top of my head. I would forget a whole bunch of people. But he had regular characters that would appear with him, and he also had regular characters or characterizations that he played, where he would be doing the interview with the man on the street, or he would be doing the letters to the editor, where he would actually read letters to the editor, assuming the voice and the mannerisms of the person who would have written the letter. Very funny stuff. And that's because that was Allen's kind of humor. That was who he was. He was a musician. He was an entertainer. So the original Tonight Show is very much of a variety show. That's where Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet are introduced, and they're the permanent singers on there for that length of time. And I suppose what's interesting about that Tonight Show is that you have Allen doing this very successfully, as you say, very different from what we come to see. Then the Tonight Show, when he leaves, and you have Jack Paar as the host of Tonight. Paar is a very different individual, and he is a monologist primarily. His monologue is the centerpiece of the show, and his ability to be able to interview people and react to them. And so Paar is the one, I think, who establishes the talk show format that Carson and the rest of them will go on to make the standard. You don't have that without Paar. But I think that it's Paar who introduces the difference between the Allen Show and the Carson Show. And it's too bad that you don't see somebody like Steve Allen on in Late Night Today. I suppose you would say that the closest thing to that would be a show like Saturday Night Live, but it would be Saturday Night Live as if it had a permanent host.
So the 1960s come along, and for me, there seems to be a clear divide. It seems like the first 6 or 7 years of the 60s, the variety shows, to me, start getting a bit stale. And then the late 60s come along, you get Laugh-In, the Smothers Brothers, even you get something like Hee Haw, which was a syndicated show, and there seems to be a second life introduced into them. Let's talk about the early 60s, though, because you mentioned things like the ubiquitous kind of holiday specials and people like the Andy Williams. I'm seeing Danny Kaye, Dean Martin. I remember Dean Martin's show. You have the holdover of Gleason, and towards the end of the 60s you also get Carol Burnett's show. But it seems that, in my view, variety shows tended to get a bit stale.
Yeah. I think that you look at the beginning of the 60s, and the major carryover that you would have from the 50s would be Lawrence Welk, but I don't really consider him a variety show. That's more of a big band show. You never had anything but music on Lawrence Welk, so leaving him out, you're right. You've got Sullivan, you've got Andy Williams, you've got different acts of that kind. Dinah Shore, Red Skelton, those are the people who are making the transition into the 60s. And it is a very formulaic type of time, because you're looking at the actors, or I'm sorry, the singers primarily, who have had the commercial success that would enable them to be able to host their own show. Um, I think Andy Williams is the prime example of that. He had been rumored to be in line for his own program for some time leading into the very early 60s, 1962, when he gets his own show. But it's a personality driven show. Andy Williams is a very talented singer. He is an immensely warm individual. People like Andy Williams. I like Andy Williams. I would tune into the Andy Williams show to watch that. He's got talented individuals. He's got the Osmonds. He's got his brothers that come on at Christmas time, and there are certain bits, skits that will happen based on who his guests might be for the week. But you're right, that is a formulaic show, and that is really what the early part of the 60s are all about. If you look at someone like Bing Crosby, he never has a regular show, but he has specials, not just the Christmas specials, but occasional specials throughout the year. And that's the same kind of a show that Crosby would have. It's and I say this not to be critical, but it is kind of a paint by numbers type of show. So you see various people succeeding or failing with that. Bob Newhart had his own show that was based off of his success with his record that won all the Grammys, but the Button Down Mind of Bob Newhart, I think it was. And so Newhart has a comedy variety show. You have a show called The Entertainers, in which he's one of three hosts, with Carol Burnett was the second, and the third host is escaping my mind at the moment. But you had Steve Lawrence with his own show. Lawrence at that point was seen as kind of a protege of Gleason's, and so Gleason's company produces Steve Lawrence's variety show. These shows are all very similar in their content and similar in their construction. So you're right. The first part of the 60s is defined by that kind of a show. And I would say one entertainer who ran into a problem with that format was Judy Garland.
Yeah.
Now she was one of the last holdouts that was seen as a big name that you could capture on television. There was Judy Garland, Doris Day, and Danny Kaye were three individuals that TV really wanted. And Garland was the most problematic, not only because of her own personal problems, but it was very difficult to figure out a format that was going to work for her, and it was very difficult to find a stable production for that show. They were always changing directors, they were changing producers, the network was meddling in it a lot. The network had the idea of what they wanted to do with a Judy Garland show that was at loggerheads with what Garland herself wanted to do and with what the viewers wanted to see. And so that became one of the more spectacular failures on television. But I think the sad part about Garland's show is that they finally found the right formula when it was too late. They figured out that what people wanted to see was just Judy singing. And the last few shows were hour-long shows where it was nothing but her singing or a guest star, and the two of them doing nothing but singing. Those were very good, very successful, very solid shows, but by then it was too late to change. Danny Kaye's show ran for 4 years, and one of the reasons Kaye finally made the commitment to go to television is because his star in the movies was beginning to fade a bit. The movies that he had acted in, movies like White Christmas, the Secret Life of Walter Mitty,
Hans Christian Andersen.
Yes, exactly. The whimsical patter song type of things that he had done were falling out of favor. And so Kaye comes in to finally do his variety series. It ran for 4 years. It had a good run. The network was disappointed with it, I think. It never became the hit that they thought it would be. And depending again on the accounts you read, if you read some of the contemporary accounts that were written at the time in a publication like TV Guide, you'll find that a lot of network people felt that Kay did not give his all on the show, that he didn't put out the way he could have, the way they expected him to. Now, people from the Kay camp, people who worked on the show with him, would disagree with that. They would say that he was always dedicated to the success of the show. Be that as it may, if you watch the Danny Kaye show, and if you pare it down to its elements, what are you going to see? You're going to see him performing, you're going to see him singing, you're going to see a bunch of comic skits, and you're going to see his guest star. And you're in some of the later years, you're going to see him sitting down and talking with his guest star. But it, stripped away from everything else, is a pretty prototypical variety show.
Yeah.
Doris Day, I'll just throw her in. Doris Day is the outlier in that, because when she came to TV, she didn't come as the host of a variety show. She did a sitcom. And so that's what makes her different. But she was the third figure that people really wanted to get into TV. She doesn't count in what we're talking about because she took a different path. Sammy Davis Jr. should have been a huge success on television. He did not face some of the problems that Nat King Cole did. Nat Cole had his own variety show in the 50s, and it was a very good show, but it suffered from the fact that he was black. They couldn't get national sponsors, so the network was carrying the show, doing all of the they were basically supporting the show financially. All the stars who appeared on the show, and he had some of the biggest stars on the show, were all doing it either for scale or even below that because they believed in him, wanted his show to succeed.
Well, didn't Betty White also have at one point a show?
She did.
And there was
Betty
a
White had a
controversy
show.
where the network, I think, was a sponsor wanted to fire one of the black performers, and she said,
Yep.
"If he goes, I go."
I go, yes. I can't remember who that was. It might have been Arthur from the Lawrence Welk show, Arthur Duncan. It might have been him. But yes, she was very open about that and very insistent on that, I think, to her everlasting credit. But by the time you get to Sammy Davis's show, some of that has gone away. There's still a problem there. I'm not trying to say that everything was sorted out by then, but the two problems that Sammy Davis had were, one, he came late to the party in terms of realizing he had to promote his own show. He felt that because of a star of the magnitude that Sammy Davis was, he didn't think he should have to go on other shows to promote it, either as a guest on other variety shows or going on the Carson Show and shows like that to promote it. He thought that was beneath him, and I don't want to say that that was all because of ego. It was just that he didn't think a big star should have to do something like that. And so the show suffered at the outset for that reason, and he finally realized what he needed to do, and he did it all. He promoted the heck out of that show, but it was, again, too late. The other problem was that, if you can believe this, and it's hard to describe this now to anybody who thinks about it. He had done a couple of specials on ABC, and they were very successful, a couple of variety specials, and NBC wants him to do his own show. And so he signs to do it, except there's a clause in his contract with ABC for the variety show the special that he was appearing in. Not an uncommon clause at the time, but it stated he couldn't appear on any other network in any other form of show until X number of weeks after the show had debuted. Now, apparently, NBC thought that they could work around this, or he thought that they could work around it, and they could reach an agreement with ABC on it. But ABC wouldn't budge on this. They wouldn't be bought out. They wouldn't budge on any kind of an accommodation. So he hosts the first episode of the Sammy Davis Jr. show. And then for the next 3 weeks, he has guest hosts. He has Sean Connery as a guest host. Johnny Carson is a guest host. But it's not an auspicious way to begin the run of a variety show, to have you only host the initial episode and then have guest hosts for the next 3 weeks. And by the time he comes back, I think the handwriting is on the wall. I just wanted to mention that because it shows that not every big star could come on to television and be a big success.
Well, Dean Martin, his buddy, also. I mean, he had. I think the show went through a couple of permutations from the mid '60s to the late '70s. I don't think it was ever a big hit show, but he did a similar thing. I mean, he would open the show and then he'd disappear for like 45 minutes.
Dean Martin, I think, for my money, Dean Martin has the best variety show of the 60s. I think it was a terrific show. The background, which is important to understand, is that Dean Martin was already a big star. He was a highly paid movie star. He was a highly paid recording artist. He didn't need to do a variety show on television, and he didn't want to do a variety show. He had hosted the Hollywood Palace once. NBC liked what they saw. They came to him and, we want to give you a weekly series of your own. I don't want to do it. He said, well, what would it take to get you on the show? He gave them a list of outrageous demands, from a salary that would make him the highest paid entertainer in history anywhere, to only having to rehearse maybe the day of the show, to not having to do dress rehearsal, not having to show up during the week, not having to step into skits until they were actually done, where he'd read off of the cue cards, but he wouldn't know what anybody else in the skit was going to do. He gave them a list of demands that were so outrageous that he left confident that no network in their right mind would ever agree to them and that he wouldn't have to do this show. Well, they agreed to all of them. And he sat down with his family, the story goes, and told them, they've agreed to everything. I guess I'm going to have to do the show. They asked me what it would take. They gave me everything. I got to do it. So Dean comes on the show, and for the years of his show, he's basically himself. He comes on, does a little bit of a monologue, does his drunk shtick. Has a tremendous lineup of stars, does some of the skits, and again, when you watch Dean in his skits, what's great about them is that you can tell, knowing the background of the story that I've told, where he didn't have to rehearse them and he only knew what his lines had to be. When you watch him in a skit with Jonathan Winters, who is a frequent guest on the show, and I mean, nobody knows what Jonathan Winters is going to do anyway. Another failed variety show, by the way, the Jonathan Winters show. But nobody knows what Jonathan Winters is going to do anyway, let alone in a situation like this. But Dean's strength in this is his ability to react to what's going on, and he's hearing what Winters is doing for the first time, just like the audience is, and so he's reacting to that, and he's not staying in character, and he's breaking up as he's listening to these things and then reading his own lines, and he's beginning to understand the absurdity of some of the lines he has as he's saying them. But people love this kind, they love the way he plays into these. One of the great examples is he and Winters are sitting next to each other in an airplane, and Dean is pretty much playing himself, and Winters is playing one of his country bumpkin type characters. And at one point, Winters says, "We just got done burying my brother," and Martin says, "Was he dead?" And you can see him at the same time reacting when he said that to how ridiculous this line was. And Winters comes back and says, well, he was after we buried him. And and Dean is trying unsuccessfully to keep a straight face. There's another similar bit that he does with Bob Newhart where he's trying and failing to keep a straight face throughout Newhart's deadpan bits. And he asks Newhart, at one point his character asks Newhart, is there anything I can get you? And Newhart says, well, better straight man would be good, and breaks both of them up. So Dean's great appeal is that he's just being himself, and people love this. And when he's singing, and it is a conventional variety show in a way, but not completely, because of the uniqueness of him. When it transitions from the Dean Martin variety show to the Dean Martin comedy hour, where the emphasis is on the comedy, not on the other aspects of a variety show. That's where he introduces the Dean Martin Celebrity Roast. Yeah. And it begins as a segment within the show where it's called where they're roasting the star of the week, or the star of the hour. And when Martin ends his variety show, it is resurrected as a weekly roast. And that's where the whole hour is roasting the celebrity of the week. And as you pointed out, he disappears for long stretches of that show where the emphasis is on the character, the person that's being roasted, and the roastee. And so you'll have these regular people who are coming on there. Martin, like everybody else, has a regular group of people that have appeared on his shows as frequent guests and do this frequently throughout the roasting period. You have somebody like Foster Brooks with his drunk act, which is very funny, and he's in character each week doing his drunk routine with the honoree. You have Orson Welles, who was a good friend of Dean's and would kind of lend a little class to the proceedings. You had Red Buttons, whose shtick was always that he would come out and say, so and so never got a dinner, and that was he was talking about, our honoree tonight, Jack Benny or whomever. We're honoring him tonight, but I want to think about all of the other people out there throughout time who never got a dinner. And you go back to Alexander the Great and all of these other people. So and Jonathan Winters was on there as well. And you'd have all of these people in. And the only time you would really see Dean was either in a reaction shot, where you would show him breaking up supposedly to what he had just heard, or when he introduces the next speaker, where he's doing his drunk shtick. And he is in a way returning to the origins of the variety show. He's become Ed Sullivan. He's the MC, and he's introducing each person as they come on, and he does his own little bit, and otherwise he's only the impetus for the show. He instigates it, but he's not in much of it otherwise, unless he's in some byplay with one of the speakers. So he disappears at that point, and though they're funny. I like the roasts. They're funny, but it's too bad people don't have a chance to see more of the variety shows, because those are just excellent variety entertainment shows. And Dean is very funny in them, and he's very smooth and very relaxed. But again, it is in many ways, just a regular variety show.
Yeah. Jonathan Winters that you mentioned, he's an interesting case because he's one of those comedians that I think was so far ahead of his time. I mean, I think his show is in the mid-60s, 64, 65. Yep. He just missed by 3 or 4 years the sort of coming revolution of the variety shows at the end of the 60s. And I look at him as sort of, I mentioned Jackie Gleason and his characters and the pathos. He's almost postmodern Jonathan Winters.
Yeah.
If Gleason was a chess master, Jonathan Winters is sort of doing that Star Trek thing, the three-level chess,
Hmm.
comedically. What are your thoughts on why Winters failed?
I think you hit it right on the head about him in a way being ahead of his time. I remember reading a letter to the editor after one of his specials, a letter to the editor and TV Guide from someone who thought he definitely was not funny, and they categorized him as one of what were called at the time the sick comedians, that they would base their humor on various aspects of society. I'm thinking of somebody like Shelley Berman or some of the blue comedians, even Lenny Bruce. That gives you a mistaken impression that Winters might have been blue, and he wasn't. But what he was definitely riffing off of a part of society that people weren't accustomed to. And in small doses, as when he would guest on the Jack Parr show, it's incredibly funny. I think that America perhaps was not ready for a full diet of that kind of a show. As you point out, I think if you see vintage Winters putting him in a different era, that show would have been extremely successful, or at least very successful. But I think it probably was just ahead of its time, and it was presenting a type of entertainment show that people weren't used to seeing on TV.
Um, then along comes the Vietnam War, and things really do change. And I want to,
Hmm.
you probably know a few more shows in this psychedelic kind of vein, but I want to talk about the three biggies in my mind. The first one was Laugh-In. The second is the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. And the third one is almost forgotten, but it was known by a number of titles: the Playboy Hour, Playboy After Night,
Hmm.
and that one was really odd. I mean, Laughing and the Smothers were just bizarre psychedelic. But when you get to the Playboy, which was a late night show,
Yeah.
almost a precursor to Saturday Night Live, you had you had Hugh Hefner just wandering around, being Hugh Hefner, talking to oh, there's Ringo Starr. Let's talk to
Hmm.
Ringo, kind of thing.
And
Talk about
yeah.
those three shows and the sort of psychedelic explosion of the
Well,
variety
that,
show.
the Hefner show is very interesting because, of course, Hefner had a passion for jazz, and he was a great champion of jazz, especially black jazz, and the artists who wouldn't necessarily be mainstream enough to be seen on television. His show gave a great opportunity for talent like that and for comedians that you didn't normally see on TV at the time. Comedians who you might have seen at the Hungry Eye, or it's the Blue Angel, or some of the other clubs in New York and San Francisco, but weren't mainstream television acts. Hefner was a great um, opportunist, or gave great opportunity for people like that to appear on his show. He was a terrible host, and he would be the first to admit it. And he had these beautiful women from the magazine and from the mansion who would kind of be like the gold diggers were to Dean, except they didn't sing. They were just there to look pretty, and they did a very good job of that. But Hefner was not there to be a good host. He was there to be the instigator again of all of these other acts. And I think that regardless of what you might think of Hugh Hefner as a human being or as a host, I think Hefner deserves a great deal of credit for introducing a lot of these acts that would have been considered too avant-garde for television. And it was a very sophisticated feel, a very sophisticated vibe. The idea of what makes the Playboy gentleman, that kind of thing. And I think that is a show that broke a lot of barriers on television. That you don't, I'm glad to see that they issued some of those acts from that show on DVD, because I think it's something that does deserve to be seen. It's a precursor to what's coming on. So I'm glad you brought him up, because you don't think of him normally in that vein. The Smothers Brothers show is really interesting, because if you look at it in its earliest days, it's an extremely conventional variety show. If you, I remember a few years ago, I had the opportunity to preview the DVD of the best of the Smothers Brothers. And one of the things about it, when you watched the early shows, was to realize how completely conventional this show was. It had traditional artists, it had skits, it had the brothers doing what hosts on a variety show do. And maybe their humor was a little more politically tinged than we were used to seeing, but there was nothing unusual about the Smothers Brothers show. It's when they start to get more topical, when Tom in particular becomes more active in the production of the show, takes a more active behind the scenes role, and they begin to bring in acts like Joan Baez that are in the anti-war vein, and Pete Seeger, who gets censored from the show for singing Knee Deep in the Big Muddy, which was an anti-war song. And you get this pushback from the administration, from the Johnson administration. You get this pushback from the network, who's upset because they don't make the show available for preview, so that they can't pass it through the censors and decide what shouldn't be on there. At the same time, you see it in the clothing, where they start to dress more as the mods do, and they start to use the colors, and you see the hairstyles evolving, and you see the entertainers on there. When you have the Doors on there, you have the different acts that signal the more psychedelic era of television coming through. Now that wasn't the only show where you would see them. You see Vanilla Fudge on the Ed Sullivan Show, and it's a treat, because you're seeing the Sullivan production people trying to give you a psychedelic background, and you're seeing a group on there, or Janis Joplin or someone like that, doing these entirely un-Sullivan-like shows. But Sullivan is in tune with the times. It's just
and Vanilla Fudge actually does the Supremes.
Yes, they do. I love their version of that, and so it's a very interesting thing to look at from an aesthetic standpoint. But what the brothers do is they combine all of these elements into one, and they present it in such a way that it's something people have not seen, and they either love it or they hate it. And unfortunately, the network comes down on the side of the people who hate it. They felt the show was becoming too dangerous, that they were getting too much in trouble with the administration, and that the brothers were showing too much independence, rebellion, unwillingness to go along with the way the show was supposed to be. Now, how much of what CBS was demanding from the brothers, how much of it was as a result of what the administration was demanding from them, and how much of it was a power struggle between the network and the brothers for control of the show, and how much of it was the network simply trying to set down standards as difficult as could be, in hopes that the brothers would wind up voiding their contract by not fulfilling the terms of it. How much of each of those goes into the ultimate downfall of the show, I'm not sure. But I think that if you could take a phrase from the time, unsafe at any speed, that would describe the Smothers Brothers show. And today you'd look at it and you'd think, well, what's the big deal? You had to be there to appreciate it at the time.
And we mentioned memes, and you just talked about a phrase. No show in history probably came up with more then current memes than Laugh-In did during his 5 or 6 year run.
Sock It
To Me. The presidential run of I forget the guy, Paulson, Pat Paulson.
Pat Paulson, yep.
The guy with the mustache and the bowler hat, and Ruth Buzzy, and all of those things. The Lily Tomlin, Goldie Hawn. They all had these indelible characters that, it was just a supernova that for 2 or 3 years shone, and then just as quickly was gone.
You're right. It was the biggest thing on TV at the time. And that's another one of those shows that I'm interested at how it's aged. It's on TV. It's on DVD. there's obviously an audience for it, but a lot of the contemporary commentary about Laugh-In, and by contemporary I mean today, you show it to somebody today, and they'll say, "Well, what's the big deal?" But you had to be there to see it. It introduced so many different concepts that we weren't accustomed to seeing on American television. All these blackout skits, skits that would maybe only have 2 or 3 lines of dialogue in them, sight gags, the party, the scene where you'd have these beautiful bikini-clad women who might have jokes tattooed on the back on their backs. You'd have that wall where you'd open up a door and pop through it, and you might have a one-liner, or you might react with somebody in a little door that was underneath you. But it was anarchy, really. It was the antithesis of the traditional variety show, in that it had no format at all. That was its format. And you didn't bring on guests to sing or to perform as it would be conventionally seen. You might have Sammy Davis Jr. as your special guest, but he's not going to come on there to sing a song. He's going to be in a short skit where he's standing next to a piano and he starts to sing the first line from a classical song, and maybe the glass breaks or the piano collapses or he gets hit in the face with a pie, something like that. There is nothing conventional about what they do. Skits with no beginning and no ending. Nowadays we see things like that with Saturday Night Live, with Monty Python, with Fridays, with other shows from the past and the present. But back then you didn't see anything like that, and it was a very different way of doing things, and very controversial. Again, anti-establishment. A lot of jokes about sex and about drugs and about the war that a lot of people in Middle America were offended by. And you look at it's a product of its time, in that if you try to view it through the lens of today, you don't do so well with it, because you don't understand what the big deal was about if you're making a joke about the pill or about birth control or premarital sex. And we're used to that now, but people weren't back then. And you could argue, rightly or wrongly, as to whether or not that was a proper source of humor for a television show. But today it is. Back then it wasn't.
And as we close out the 60s and then head into the 70s, the most successful show that though came out of that milieu in terms of years and probably influence wasn't Smothers, wasn't Laugh-In, wasn't Hefner, but it was Carol Burnett. Yep. Which was, in a sense, Carol Burnett in some ways is a throwback. Probably the one spin that she puts on the format that wasn't done before is she opens her show and sometimes closes her show with a 5 or 10 minute, not monologue, but Q&A with the audience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, Carol Burnett is the successor to Gary Moore, I think. And I didn't mention Gary Moore, and I probably should have, because at one time I think Gary Moore held the record for the most hours that one entertainer had appeared on television in a career. Gary Moore started out on radio, made the transition to TV, was closely identified with Arthur Godfrey, had a morning show, finally went on to a primetime show that he hosted for several years. He was at the same time the host of I've Got a Secret, so he was on TV a lot. Carol Burnett was a regular on his show. She had been making a name for herself as a comedian. She'd had a song about I've got a crush on John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State in the Eisenhower administration. And she had done a number of very successful specials on TV with Julie Andrews and with others. And so she had, in a sense, been groomed, I think, by Gary Moore to become a variety show host. And when Gary Moore went off the air, there was a little bit of time when Gary Moore and Danny Kaye were on at the same time. But one of Danny Kaye's comedians, stock comedians, was Harvey Korman. And in a way, Carol Burnett is the continuation of the Danny Kaye show, because she takes Harvey Korman on as a regular, and she takes his time spot, and there's a bit of a crossover perhaps in the production staff, but really what you see her as is a continuation of the Gary Moore show, and she's the first woman to have a successful variety show on television. There were a lot of people who doubted that she would be able to pull it off. Gary Moore was not one of those doubters. He was one of her biggest champions. But she comes on, and as you mentioned, she addresses the audience. She does the Q&As with the audience, and by extension, she's reaching out to the viewer. She's talking to the viewer, showing them the kinds of things that they want to see or hear about. She talks about her outfit. She talks about her hairdos. She talks about her television family. She's not on there telling jokes like a Carson would. She's engaging with the audience. And although the Carol Burnett show that we've become accustomed to seeing is the chopped up version that you'll see on MeTV, Carol Burnett and Friends, which has been running for 40 years probably, over and over and over again. And what you really see in that is only the comedy bits. Yeah. And the comedy bits are what we remember, with Lyle Wagner and Harvey Korman and Tim Conway,
and Vicki Lawrence.
Yes, and Vicki Lawrence, which it's an incredible quartet of talent. I would compare it to your show of shows in terms of having a core of talent. Tim Conway wasn't even a regular at the beginning; he was just a frequent guest. It isn't until the last few years of the show that he is a weekly regular. But you have these legendary comic bits that are still funny, and you see Conway trying to break up the rest of the cast, and you see Mama's place, Mama's Family, and you see all these. You see some of them are stock characters, some of them are one-shot characters. You see the famous takeoff on Gone with the Wind, where she's wearing the drapes that she'd pulled down from the wall. It's something I just got off the rack, and. But what you don't get to see are the musical acts that were on at the same time, as somebody like Steve Lawrence, who was virtually a regular on the show, and that he was a frequent guest, and he's always going to be on there to sing, and his wife Edie Gourmet, and a number of other great entertainers who are on there in their own right, doing their own thing, as well as being in the comic bits. You don't get to see those unless you're looking at the DVDs, or unless you're seeing some of the deep cut shows that MeTV will show, where they do show more of the Burnett show than you usually see in Carol and Company. And it's kind of nice to see those, because it is, again, a well-rounded variety show. Very, very funny, and I think timeless in a way that some of the others weren't.
And I think that one of the reasons that she succeeded and lasted 11 years, twice as long as Laugh-In, or more than twice as long, is because I think she's more close to the female Gleason. She's often compared to Lucille Ball, but as I said, I can't say that I ever really got emotionally attached to any of Lucille Ball's characters. Just to use Mama's Family as the most famous example. She plays, I forget the name of her character.
But is it Eunice?
Eunice, right. She's a downtrodden, nasty character. But there's always a moment in almost every skit where we get to see the real Eunice as sort of this shaking little child, and she's sort of like the female Ralph Cramden. And I think that's why Carol Burnett succeeded, even though she wasn't hip or as cool as the other shows that faded.
Mrs. Wiggins,
Wiggins.
And so she has her stock characters and she has her one-offs, but you're right, she comes across as an immensely likable person, and the warmth shows through in those characters. There, as you pointed out with the Mama bit, Eunice, she never plays her maliciously. There's something almost painful in it sometimes, because
she's a hurt
it's so
child
realistic.
lashing out at the rest of her family.
Yep, and that's an excellent portrayal. Whether you like the bit or not is beside the point. It is funny, it is tragic, but it is never cruel.
but it's always funny. The 1970s are upon us, and for me, this to me is the most diverse that variety shows get, and it's also the decade where basically the seeds of the downfall of most of the genre comes from. So I wanted to talk about just the utter variety of variety shows in the 1970s, and let me toss out a few, not only the names of some of them, but a few sort of genres. The first one, as a carryover from the 60s, is sort of the country variety show, or where you have Hee Haw being, I guess, the country equivalent of Laughing in some ways. Even though I think it started out as syndicated. Glenn Campbell and Johnny Cash have more traditional shows. And then there are a few other little knockoffs that I don't even remember the names of. Then we get what I would call the family-based variety shows. The Carpenters. You mentioned the Osmond Family. I think the Jackson 5 even had a show for a while. Donnie and Marie, separate from the Osmonds.
One of the most successful,
Barbara Mandrell and the Mandrell sisters later, going back to the country aspect. Then you had what would be called, I guess, musical variety shows. The Midnight Special. You had then Solid Gold, which was a countdown show with disco dancers, with up-and-coming stars. You had also... there was also another show that the name slips me. You have, of course, Saturday Night Live kicks off the late night television. So Saturday Night Live, Fridays, SCTV, In Living Color, Mad TV, and that spawned. Flip Wilson becomes the first black fellow that has a variety. And I think Flip Wilson, I don't know if he ever hit number one. He might have had one year where he squeaked in between All in the Family and Laughing before it.
But it was very successful, very popular show.
And then there was also, and I don't know, you're a few years older than me if you would remember this, even Saturday morning television started getting variety shows, not just with the cartoons, although there was a cartoon version, Yogi's Ark, which often had that. But you had Sid and Marty Krofft, who did H.R. Puffin stuff. Later came back with what was called the Krofft Super Hour, the what was it called? The Krofft Super Show. It had its own band. It would have characters from the shows, characters from other Saturday morning shows.
The Banana Splits,
Banana. That was another show that early on. But the one that I actually did a show on with an actress who was a part of it, Nan Lynn Nelson, was called Hot Hero Sandwich in 1979. It was a show that was on around noon and was topics facing children. It had Tom Cottle as a psychologist talking about the problems that children deal with, anywhere from alcoholism to teen pregnancy. And then it had its own house band, and it did comedy numbers like a Saturday Night Live. It was one of the most bizarre but interesting shows as well. So let me just go back to the beginning and let's talk about the family variety shows, and the faux family of the Brady Bunch actually got their own variety show. But Donnie and Marie, Jackson 5, the Carpenters, the faux Brady Bunch. There was just a bizarre, and there's probably some others I've forgotten. What spurred that on, do you think?
Well, I think you can go back even to the King family, which was in the 60s, but they were probably one of the first. Well, the thing about variety shows is that they're usually, not always, but they are usually the product of a popular act. And there's this phase where you've got these incredibly talented families, whether it's the Osmonds or the Jacksons, that become prime candidates to host their own show. Variety shows are, even in the 70s, still a very viable form of television, and it's a good way to be able to capitalize on a hot recording star and to be able to use that as a way to promote other stars that are going to be on your network. For example, I don't think I don't think Bob Hope ever met a variety show he wasn't willing to appear on. And Bob Hope is a guest on almost everybody's variety show. So the networks have a stockpile of acts that can appear on them. You can capitalize on somebody who's well known. And, Bobby Goldsboro had his own show for a couple of years. The Hudson brothers had their
And
own
speaking
show.
of Bobby's, didn't Bobby Sherman, the teen idol, also have a show at one point?
Yep. And so, in a way, it mirrors the early days of variety shows too. In that, I mentioned that it seemed like almost everybody had a variety show. All you had to do was show up and say you wanted one, and they'd give it to you. And the 70s are like that a lot. That with all of these people that are appearing on them. One of the things that you'll notice is that most of them, when we talk about variety, they're really only dealing with a couple of things: comedy and music. You don't have the eclecticism of the Sullivan Show, and you don't necessarily have the regular skits that you would have occasionally on the Carol Burnett Show. Flip Wilson, you've got, Geraldine and The Devil Made Me Do It, and you have recurring characters like that. But many of these shows are just reduced to comedy and music. And so that's a little different from what we had seen in the past. But I think Donnie and Maria are probably the best example of a variety show of that time. It was a very successful show. They were both very attractive, photogenic people. They were talented kids from an extremely talented family, and they were again, one of the words I keep coming back to on these shows, they were likable. People liked them, and I always have thought, particularly with the Osmonds, but you might be able to extend this to the others. The Osmonds always seemed to have something about them that even when they were acting in a skit, they were self-aware that some of the stuff they were doing was really stupid, and they kind of did some of that tongue-in-cheek, I think. And
well, the whole I'm a country girl. I'm a little bit country. I'm a little bit rock and roll.
Yeah.
So Marie was the country, and Donnie. Does anyone really believe Marie was listening to country music? I mean,
yeah, I think is very engaging to be able to show that when you can show that kind of self-awareness. Somebody I would throw in a way with the family shows is Sonny and Cher.
Yeah.
They a different kind of family,
Captain and
especially
Tennille.
Yeah, exactly. If the Captain and Tennille can have their own show, you really do come to the feeling that anybody can get one.
And Tony Orlando and Dawn.
Yup. They're everywhere. They are everywhere. Mac Davis.
Yeah.
And you'll notice some of these shows are only a season, 2-3 seasons long. They really have the Venn diagram that overlaps with the success of the singer's career when they're really hot.
Yeah.
And they're a hot commodity. They have a lot of hits and they have a successful show on TV. When the hits start to go away, as they did with Roger Miller in the 60s, the show starts to go away as a result.
And I think, didn't Marilyn McCoo and Billy Davis Jr. also have a show for...
I think it might have been a summer replacement,
yeah.
But yeah, they did. Everybody has their own show. And as the variety show dies down as a weekly format, everybody gets their own special. The Linda Carter special. And I don't make fun of any of these people for their talents because they're all much more talented than I am. But again, it's another example of capitalizing on somebody's stardom to flip them into a format they might not be familiar with.
And every of those kinds of shows seem to have either Paul Lynde or Charles Nelson Riley as sort of the token gay guy.
Yep. And Paul Lynde had his own show for a while too. Putting Paul Lynde in a family sitcom was a horrible idea. But it was everybody does have their own show. The Muppet Show, right, I would say, is perhaps the most successful variety show of the 70s.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most loved today because even within a half an hour format, it ticks all the boxes. It has a wide range of stars who are appearing either as themselves doing their own thing, whether it's singing or acting, or appearing in the skits with the Muppets. And they are furthermore selling the idea of appearing with Muppets. That would be the perfect, it's the most normal thing in the world for Michael Caine to be acting with Kermit the Frog. That's not an easy thing to sell, but it's to the talent of these people, and it's to the talent of the of Jim Henson and the Muppets themselves that they're able to not only sell this, but to make it work for maybe 5 seasons, and it to this day is one of the most loved shows of that time. It's very successful, but I think that you're beginning to see the Götterdämmerung of the variety show genre. Julie Andrews has a 1-season variety show. And again, this is coming at a time when her career is not at its peak anymore. It's on the downside, although she's still a very, very big star, but she's not able to sell a variety show. And you're starting to see these shows become less and less successful. I had a note here from something that I had read that by the end of the decade, well, even by the middle of the decade, the most popular variety show in 1975 is Cher's solo show, Not with Sonny. And that's the most popular variety show of the year, and it's only in the upper 20s in the ratings. So it's not, they're not the boffo thing that they used to be. And then as you approach the 80s, you get a show like Pink Lady and Jeff, which
I was going to mention that.
Yeah.
That's sort of like what was that? The Western Heaven's Gate. It's sort of like the Heaven's Gate of variety shows.
When you talk about hallucinogenic and psychedelic shows, this applies to the boardroom at this time. That what were they on that they thought that this was a good idea? Can you take a duo of Japanese singers who don't speak English and put them together with a comedian that has a limited name recognition and think that this is going to be a successful show? Well, it was funny over there. Well, this is the variety show format is still much more popular in some countries than it is in the United States. But I think we've hit most of the highlights of the 70s right there by just talking about this handful of shows. Carol Burnett is still a successful show, but the Dean Martin show is running out of steam, and that's going to be off the air. And you see a transition, as I suggested, to specials rather than weekly series. Perry Como has already left the weekly series grind for doing maybe a half a dozen specials a year. When Dean Martin leaves his show, when Andy Williams leaves his show, they return at least with Christmas specials, if not some others that go on beside that. But Bing Crosby has his specials. Bob Hope has his specials. But you don't see anybody doing weekly shows in the variety vein anymore. I like what you mentioned about the Midnight Special, because that's a show you don't necessarily think of as a variety show, and yet it was. It had a host. It had musical guests, a variety of guests in different genres. It often had stand-up comedians doing something else. Sometimes it had films in concert performances by other artists. And that was a successful show for almost a decade. And it's starting to show that whereas some of the old variety shows had rock elements to them, it was now possible to have a variety show consisting of nothing but contemporary music.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned that you didn't think Don Kirshner's rock concert was really a variety show, but whether it was or not, both Kirshner and Midnight Special, they would sometimes be on live because
Hmm.
you would go. Let's say if it was in New York and it was 11:30 that it came on, they go. Well, here's it's 8:30 or 9:30 farther out west, and here's Styx in concert. Ding the one, and they'd be,
Yep.
hey America, this Styx here, and they time it, and it would actually be live from a concert. 5 minutes or whatever.
Yeah, and ABC had a series called In Concert, which was, I think, once or twice a month on Fridays it would air. That was when ABC was really juggling around what they called the wide world of entertainment concept for
Yeah.
late night. And In Concert was a formidable show, but that was really not a variety show. It was a concert video of a group. But it was or several groups, but they were mostly concert performances, but still a very successful show for its time.
Well, I want to talk though about a show that's going to bridge the Pink Lady and Jeff and Saturday Night Live, and that's it's in that vein of so bad it's bad or so bad it's good. Some people will say like the Brady Bunch Hour is so bad it's good because they like the original sitcom.
Uh-huh.
Pink Lady and Jeff doesn't get that. But one of the other variety shows that's called one of the worst of all times is the original Saturday Night Live, not live from New York.
Yes.
Saturday Night Live with Howard Cosell,
Howard
of all
Cosell, yep.
people. And I remember even as a child thinking, this is ridiculous. Whether you thought Howard Cosell was a good sportscaster or a commentator on the news of sports, and we mentioned this briefly when we talked about the '72 Munich Olympics thing in an earlier show. I mean, he was so ill-suited for this.
Yeah.
He was so stiff. It boggles the mind that they could. And I think this came on like literally 3 or 4 months before SNL, and that's why they came up with the Live from New York, because they legally couldn't say Saturday Night
Right.
Live.
It was just NBC's Saturday Night.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. I think the most charitable interpretation of Cosell's show was that it was an attempt to bring back the days of Ed Sullivan and what Walter Winchell tried to do. But part of the reason for this downfall was that Sullivan knew the business inside and out, and Cosell didn't. And Cosell had the same kind of a problem that Winchell had, in that his likability rating was very low.
Yeah.
The people may have thought that it would succeed because Cosell was such a hit on Monday Night Football, but a lot of people tuned in to Monday Night Football to hate watch it. You know, they would have contests for people to throw bricks through television tubes, and people would turn down the sound on TV and listen to the game on the radio while the TV was on. And Cosell was the least popular of the three members of the Monday Night Football announcing booth. So it was either an ego trip in that Cosell forced their hand, or it was a massive misunderstanding of Cosell's popularity, as it were, on television, whatever his Q ratings were. People watched Cosell, but they didn't like him. And even though Cosell, if you look at all of the individual shows in terms of their lineups, he had some real talent on some of these shows, but he wasn't at ease. He was awkward. He was stiff. His attempts at humor weren't very successful. Even when he was funny on different appearances, as the interviews he used to do with Muhammad Ali, it was usually because he wound up playing Ali's foil.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what else you can say about it, except that it is the answer to your great trivia question about why Saturday Night Live wasn't originally called Saturday Night Live.
Yeah. And now, there's been so much said about Saturday Night Live. I don't know if you have anything to add. It spawned Fridays, which was the direct imitator for about 5 years in the late 70s, early 80s, which gave you basically Michael Richards. That basically made him a star. Then you also had in the early, maybe it was the late 80s, early 90s, In Living Color,
Yeah,
which
I was
basically,
going to say that too.
even though it was a 90% black, the biggest star becomes Jim Carrey in the
Mm-hmm.
long run. Mad TV had a nice run, but I want to talk about what I think, for my money, is by far the best of those shows, and that's Second City Television, or
Yes.
SCTV. I think if you look at it, you mentioned how some of the stuff from other variety shows doesn't hold up today. And I think that's true. Certainly of Fridays, which is a very 70s show. The 90s, in a sense, In Living in Color, it's stuck there in that era, with the like the two gay black guys, with two snaps up or whatever, three snaps or whatever. But SCTV transcends that because it made its own little filmic universe there. It
Yes.
was one. It was a fictional TV station. You had those characters. Then you had, they were so good. I remember there was the singing group, the Five Ordinary Guys, and they were singing the most bland Perry Como
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. Five neat guys.
let,
Yeah.
let, let's do a Doors song as if Perry Como did it.
Well, they had a bit, the Perry Como bit is, and this was at the same time as the movie Staying Alive, which with the music
Yeah,
from
yeah.
Saturday Night Fever, and they had a bit
Staying
about Perry Como is still
alive.
alive, and yeah, yeah, I think people want to think of SCTV as another sketch comedy show, but it had musical guests. And the genius of SCTV was that they often worked the guests into the show themselves. So that I remember that there was there's a running bit on SCTV about Dr. Tongue's 3D House of Whatever, and all these bad 3D movies. And John Candy was Dr. Tongue, and they would usually wind up on the Monster Chiller Horror Theater. But Dr. Tongue and Bruno decide to spin their success off into a restaurant, and it's called the 3D House of Beef. And Dr. Tongue is your host, and he's bringing you in as if you're the guest sitting there at the with their fabulous dinner supper club type of thing. And I think it's James Ingram who is the musical guest on that show, and he performs his big hit of the time just once, but he does it as the entertainer at the 3D House of Beef. And his dressing room is actually the cooler where they keep the sides of meat. And he's got this fur coat on as they're bringing him out of the locker there, and he's bundled up to his eyes. Man, that's cold in there. And so Ingram, playing himself, becomes a character in the skit before he becomes the singer singing his hit, which happens to be contained within the skit that he's also acting in. It's brilliant. And I think that Dr. John is on there when they're doing Polynesian Town, which is their satire of Chinatown. And again, he's playing himself as a singer, but he's also one of the characters in the drama with Candy. And then they're doing a crane shot, and the crane shot comes back as an element in other episodes throughout the time. So unlike Saturday Night Live, where they had the musical guests pretty much as standalones, SCTV had it was as if they were of the mindset that, all right, the network has told us we have to have musical guests on this show, just like Saturday Night Live does. Well, we'll have the musical guests, but we're going to make them part of the show themselves, not just entertainers. We're going to force them to play characters in the context of the show, in the context of their performance. And they do it very, very well. And that's hilarious.
My favorite one-off sketch was the one of Fantasy Island where John Candy plays Fatu, and Fatu at the end sees a comely violin that one of the guests brings, and he tries having sex with the violin, and Ricardo Montalban like Fatu, and you can see it's obviously a doll. He throws John Candy halfway across the room. But my favorite recurring skit on SCTV was the one where the guy with the Eugene Levy,
Uh-huh.
plays a sort of version of Alex Trebek in a kind of Jeopardy show that everyone is so goddamn stupid they never get
Yes.
anything right, and
Heflin,
he's like
something like
he's
that.
like Groundhog's Day that they keep bringing back the same idiots every week.
Hmm. Oh, and I when Alex Trebek passed away, and people were on social media talking about who should succeed him, I kept saying it ought to be Eugene Levy, Alex Trebell,
Yeah.
because he's already had the experience doing it, and so few people got the joke. It was too bad, but I think SCTV is a wonderful show, and one of the things that it does. Um, if you go on YouTube, there are a bunch of different stations on channels on YouTube that show clips of old shows from particular years. What they'll do is that they basically show the opening theme and credits from different shows, and so you'll see, here's what the lineup looked like in 1982 or in 1978, and they'll run through them, and they'll be doing montages of variety shows, but also of cop shows or anything like that. And all of a sudden, as you watch these, they begin to look like they were spoofs on SCTV because they did it so well on there that you'll watch a show. I'm just going to throw out a title like 240 Robert or Chopper One or any of these shows, and you see how they've put together the opening montage in the credits, and you're thinking to yourself, this looks like something they did on SCTV. And you'll see them doing a variety show spoof, and they'll have Lola Heatherton on there and some of these other characters, and then you'll see something in TV Guide about so and so's variety show, and they have this combination of guests on there. You'd have somebody like Fred Astaire and Lola Falana on the same show, and you're thinking to yourself, you know, SCTV isn't even satire. It's just real life where they've changed the names of the characters. That's how brilliant that show is.
So we mentioned Pink Lady and Jeff, and in a sense, the only network show that I think carried on with any reasonable success for a few years after 1980 was Barbara Mandrell and the Mandrell Sisters. That lasted till, 84, 85, 86, something like that. But you get one little sort of last gasp before you hit the 21st century sort of revival, and that's Ed McMahon's Star Search, which was a syndicated show. It goes back to and it's blatantly a contest. It's not like, it's blatantly a contest. And you'd have, acting competition, singing competition, I think dancing competition, stand-up comedy, and then there'd be one or two, each season might have one or two different things. And you got people, who are fairly well known. I mean, I think Roseanne Barr started on that. Brad Garrett started on that, from the Ray Romano show.
It's not Arthur Godfrey. It's Ted Mack and the original Amateur Hour, and it works very well. And I think that you're right. It's a great showcase for up and coming talent and people that were familiar then and people who've become very familiar since. And if anybody wants to say that America's Got Talent and The Voice and all of these other shows that are on now, there's nothing original about them. There's nothing original about anything on TV anymore except maybe Twin Peaks. I think everything else can find its genesis in a show from the past. And so if anybody that watched Star Search recognizes these other shows instantly.
Yeah. The one thing that I think American Idol might have done differently, or two things, is that Star Search, well, they had the American Idol characters all living together during their runs. So they were trying to tap into some of that reality TV kind of nonsense. And also they did backgrounds where you'd hear about, this singer's Uncle Ed is dying of cancer, or, her parents, divorced and her father was sent to jail, how did she cope with it, kind of thing.
Pathos always sells.
Yeah, it was that was the one minor tweak that American Idol did, and in a sense, it tried. But I think now in the revival, that I mean, we talk about Stars, not Star Search, American Idol. There's the original Fox run with what's her name? The three Randy Jackson, Simon Cowell, and who was the singer?
Yeah, I'm drawing a
Paul
blank on that
Abdul.
as yes, yes.
But now they have a few iterations of it since, and it's far more generic. And the odd thing was, the biggest star of that became Simon Cowell. Who the hell ever heard of him before that? And
That's right.
he became the kingmaker. And now I mean, the guy I've read is worth $2 or $3 billion because he's got his hand in every country seems to have an America's Got Talent. You know, Israel's got talent. Zanzibar has talent. You know.
And that's the thing. That's the thing that differentiated it from the old shows. Because I'll go back to Amateur Hour. You remember I said once that Gary Moore, I thought, might have had the record for the most airtime on television at one time. Ted Mack had the record as well later on. But the thing is that in hosting the original Amateur Hour, Ted Mack knew he was not the star. And he never made the show about himself. He was the glue that held the show together. Without Ted Mack, you don't have the show. But he never overshadowed the stars. And that's the thing, is that the biggest star on that show becomes Simon Cowell, one of the judges. And that never would have happened back in the old days. Even Ed McMahon, you know, on Star Search. Well, Ed McMahon made a career out of being a second banana. And Ed didn't try to turn Star Search into the Ed McMahon show. He understood what his role was.
So let's look now here, going in the future as things do cycle. You know, I mentioned early on something like the Gong Show from the late '70s, which was a spoof of that Amateur Hour kind of thing. Do you see coming on maybe Netflix or YouTube television or something? Can you see that there's anything? Because we have all these TikTok things. Do you think that there's anywhere for a variety type show to go these days, or is it just going to be endless recycling for the next 100 years?
I suspect the latter. I think you're probably right. There's certainly room for creativity on television. I mean, I think everybody would agree with that. And there are a lot of talented people out there, but what you have is such a fragmented audience now. You could never have a Sullivan type show, for example, because you could never have the kind of entertainment that would appeal to everybody. So you're automatically talking about a niche show to begin with. And you're right, you've got TikTok stars, you've got YouTube stars, you have all kinds of people that there's no lacking the ability to find people to fill a show. Are they going to have broad enough appeal to go beyond a niche audience that you could probably gain just by having the videos rather than actually putting a show together? Is it going to be, when you look at the shows that have attempted to be on the new media, perhaps one of the most successful ones has been Conan O'Brien, but there have been others who have gone on and tried to do shows on a Netflix kind of thing, in other words, an unconventional type of show for a streamer would be a weekly or a nightly show. But you know, Chelsea Handler tried it, and they're going to fall. I think they're either going to fall into the straight talk show format, where they're not going to be long enough that you can have talk and performances, or they're going to be comedy shows where they're pretty much just an excuse for two or three people to get up and do their shtick. When we talk about variety in its broader sense, where you have a variety of entertainment, either genres or performers, I don't know who you would have on. To be honest, I don't know anybody who could capture a large, Taylor Swift. You could have Taylor Swift on a variety show, and you would have somebody who would have the broad appeal. But Taylor Swift isn't going to do a variety show like that in all likelihood. You might get her to do
But
something like Saturday Night Live, but why bother?
yeah, but a variety show is going to have a lot less budget than your typical show with where you have to build sets
Precisely.
and whatnot, or
Hmm.
a drama show where you're going to have a realistic looking hospital or cop
Yep.
show or whatnot. So I mean, I think you can get people. I'm just wondering if it's too passe. I mean,
Yeah,
I've mentioned Ernie
you're gonna get
Kovacs.
viewers. I don't think you're gonna be able to get people, but I don't know if you're gonna be able to get people with a wide enough
Yeah.
appeal that it would make sense to do a television show as opposed to allowing them to do their own thing in their own way. You might have three or four TikTok stars, and for them and for anybody putting on a show, unless you just have them perform remotely, I'm not sure that it would make sense to get them together
Yeah.
to do a show and to make that show a recurring program every week with a different group of stars. You're right. The people are there. There's no lacking for stars or for talent, but I don't know if you can get any with broad enough appeal and that you can put together a show that's going to be able to sustain itself unless it is in such a niche market that and there you'd have to look at it being almost a lifestyle show that a network was going to subsidize. Back in the old days, MTV could have done something like that because it would have fit their demographic as an entertainment network, and therefore they're going to have an entertainment show. They could have even had their own stars hosting it, but that MTV doesn't exist anymore. And I'm not, country music television was able to make it work when they had the Statler brothers and they had Nashville Tonight or whatever the show was called. They had a good run with those kinds of shows, but again, they weren't trying to attract any kind of widespread audience. They were going to attract people who had the same core values and already liked what was on the network. So it was an outgrowth of the network's mission. In terms of trying to do anything other than that, I don't know that there are that many streamers or stations that have an identity so well defined that you'd be able to succeed doing it.
Well,
But
okay.
I could be wrong too.
Yeah, I mean, occasionally you do get musicians. You mentioned Taylor Swift started out
Mhm.
with sort of independent, but then again, she came from a rich family. Justin Bieber is
Mhm.
another one. So I would think it would probably have to be someone that becomes a sort of a supernova. Like
Yeah.
if there was a Robin Williams type personality that just took over and decided, uh, we want you to come to he has a YouTube channel and said, Robin the 2.0, we want you to come to NBC. We'll,
Mhm.
and does the Dean Martin thing. We'll give you whatever you want.
Yep.
That's about the only way I could see it. Let me just ask you though before we finish. Was there ever any local variety shows that had any influence? Maybe they never made it to network television, but back in the 50s or 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, we
They.
mentioned Kovacs, but
Mhm.
he seems to be an outlier.
They had influences in different ways. I think that, back in Philadelphia, Ed McMahon hosted his own variety show. And I think that you could see almost every area of the country had local variety shows at one point in time or another. That's when there was a much bigger emphasis on local programming than there is now. And you had time that had to be filled because the network didn't fill it all. You didn't have infomercials or anything like that. So every part of the country, every station had what they'd call a local variety show. I think that their influence is in people who appeared on that show who went on to greater things. And I think it is as often the hosts of the show as the entertainment. You wouldn't say that Ed McMahon's show, and I can't remember what it was called. He had a couple of shows. Then there were shows on WGN and WBBM in Chicago. And the very fact that I can't remember their names, it tells me that the shows themselves didn't have an influence. But what they did do was they trained people. and they got visibility for those people. And so McMahon is a known quantity by the time he's able to work his way up to the network. A lot of these hosts were able to get a foothold in the entertainment business. Dave Garroway with his show in Chicago before he went on to the Today Show, they were able to get a foothold, and some of the people who appeared on these shows were able to get their foot in the door and do something like that. So I don't know. The shows themselves are probably what you would call proving grounds or birthplaces, training grounds for people to become stars. So the individual shows themselves, I don't think, are as influential as the opportunities they gave the people to go on, both from the production side and from the performing side, onto other things.
Yeah. Just in closing, I'd say you mentioned Monty Python earlier, and that did have a run here in the U.S., which was interesting. And I do remember there was a British comedian, Benny Hill, who had a show in the late 70s that was good. But mostly, it seems to me that variety shows seem to have come to basically an end, with the exception of these talent shows.
I would agree.
We'll see if it's resurrected. So anyway, good spending another couple of hours with you.
Always a pleasure.
Let's shoot to do the whole 1960s maybe after Thanksgiving.
Excellent.
All right. Well, take care.
Okay. Take care.